It's 26 years since Armenian forces decimated the civilian population in the town of Khojaly. We look back at the biggest massacre in the ongoing Karabakh dispute and ask if another conflict is brewing. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the Hajjali Massacre. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the disputed region of Karabakh, claimed by Azerbaijan, has been occupied by Armenian-backed separatists. Neither side has been willing to budge on a political solution. Instead, the conflict has cost the lives of more than 30,000 people. Human Rights Watch says among the dead are more than 160 Azerbaijani civilians massacred in Khojaly, although Azerbaijani government officials put that number above 600. It happened in 1992 when Armenian forces blockaded the enclave and attacked it. The surrounding territory has been an effective no man's land ever since. So, what hopes are there of a resolution? Here's Christine Pirovalakis.
The Armenians killed infants, elderly people without blinking their eyes. Then they shot my sister, then my mother. My father, my two sisters, and my brother were held captive.
26 years on, the massacre of Khojaly still haunts the living. At the height of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in 1992, Armenian and Russian troops murdered at least 160 ethnic Azerbaijani men, women, and children as they tried to evacuate the town of Khojaly. Some were burned alive, others mutilated and tortured. Azerbaijan says a total of 613 people were killed, making it the largest massacre in the conflict. Armenian authorities dispute the massacre ever took place. But these Azerbaijanis doubt they will ever forget.
They were shooting us, but at the same time they were punishing us. They decapitated captives, stabbed babies, cut off their arms, legs. They tortured our corpses. In war, normally fighters die, but they killed babies, young girls, elderly people. Our hearts will never forget that.
Despite a fragile calm over the past 2 decades, both sides have had soldiers and civilians killed in sporadic breaches of the ceasefire. The most serious was in April 2016, when an all-out war erupted between the two sides, killing more than 400 people. The fighting lasted 4 days before a ceasefire was finally agreed.
Это действительно проблема, которая всем нам досталась из нашего еще советского прошлого. Знаю, насколько это острый вопрос для.
For more than 2 decades, the war in Nagorno-Karabakh has been silent, cold, and dirty. The mountainous enclave, about 4,400 square kilometers, is inside Azerbaijan and has been in dispute since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Under the Soviets, Nagorno-Karabakh was populated largely by ethnic Armenians. But as the Soviet Union began to fall apart, ethnic Armenians declared independence from Azerbaijan in a referendum, and friction exploded into war. Between 1988 and 1994, around 30,000 people died, and 1 million were displaced from the region before a ceasefire in 1994 brokered by Russia. Nagorno-Karabakh has since been under the control of local ethnic Armenian forces and the Armenian military, despite the refusal of the UN to recognize their claim of autonomy. No peace deal has ever been signed, and violence has flared up sporadically in recent years. Countless international efforts to settle the conflict between Christian Armenians and the overwhelmingly Muslim Azerbaijanis have brought no results. Azerbaijan has repeatedly threatened to take back the breakaway region by force. Intensive negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan are expected to continue after joint presidential elections are held in April. But with resistance from Armenia and Azerbaijan to find a compromise a lot stronger than external pressure to resolve the conflict, is a solution within reach. Christine Pirovalakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's start off our conversation with the spokesman for Azerbaijan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Hikmet Hajiev. Hikmet, good to have you on the Newsmakers. 26 years after Khojaly, what do you want from the Armenians?
And actually, Azerbaijan's message is that let's build a sustainable peace in the region. And the region deserves and needs a peace and a security and full regional cooperation. But for that to happen, Armenia should understand that Armenia, by use of force, occupied sovereign territories of Azerbaijan. It's a violation of the norms and principles of international law. And Armenia also ethnically cleansed million more Azerbaijanis from the occupied territories. What Azerbaijan wants, it's based simply on the norms and principles of international law and 4 resolutions of the United Nations Security Council as a pull-out and withdrawal of Armenian armed forces from the occupied territories of Azerbaijan, and to start step-by-step process of resolution of the conflict. Conflict is too complex. With one package, we cannot sort out the conflict. There are different elements are involved: return of the refugees, security, some other elements as well. And therefore, the first fundamental issue is the seizing of the fact of occupation. Let's take out military risks and that cause escalation of the conflict. Escalation is every moment possible because an armed force of 2 countries are facing one another. And it's in a trench war scenario of the Second World War. That's the realities on the ground. Let's change the status quo that's based on occupation.
You say escalation is always possible. We saw trouble in 2016. It was war again, and people feared it might even get much, much worse. How close are we to that happening again?
Simply, it can happen every moment because we are still having a persistent and continued fact of occupation. Armenian armed forces are physically present in the occupied territories of Azerbaijan, and Armenian armed forces also continue certain kind of provocations or military political provocations, and they are going hand by hand and complementing with one another. And if you have more than 100,000 soldiers are sitting in the trench face to face and exchanging fire, and on every moment this kind of escalations could happen. And therefore Azerbaijan's key message and a fundamental message, not only Azerbaijan, but international community, including OSCE, Minsk Group co-chair countries, are underlining this fact that first and utmost, initially Armenian armed forces should be withdrawn from the regions occupied of Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan as a first step towards building a confidence, understanding, and also most importantly, having a de-escalation and taking out military facts and providing prerequisites for the political solution of the conflict.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Hikmet. Good to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure.
We're going to open it up to the panel in a few moments, but first, here's the story of one of Khojaly's survivors.
My husband went to Khojaly voluntarily. He was a policeman and we went with him. We had a very good life while living there. This tragedy came upon us after Armenians committed the massacre. My husband was martyred and I was captured. I spent 15 days in captivity. In Khojaly, our men hid us in the basement so that Armenians would not capture us. They were gone, but they had put women and children in the basement in order to protect us from being shot. Our men also fought to keep the Armenians away, but they could not prevent it. Armenians came to the basement and caught us. This child was 3 days old then, and this one was 1.5 years old. Then they held us captive. They beat us, punching me in the mouth and ears. I am partially deaf now. My son in that photo was hit by a bullet. The bullets hit his head and then his leg. As the child grew, the bullet wounds got worse. We treated him so that he survived. However, we could not heal my other child. My husband worked as a policeman and I could not see him when the Armenians captured me. Later, when the Armenians exchanged us with the captives, I learned that they had shot my husband. They caught me and told me to find my husband and bring him back to them. They told me to bring him alive. I told them that he is my husband, so why should I bring him? At that moment, they hit me with their gun and I fell down. In that photo, I was with my child. It is the 26th anniversary of the Khojaly tragedy. We want our lands back from Armenians. The spirit of our children will be glad then. My husband is martyred and let his soul be glad. Our children's soul and the souls of our sisters and brothers will only be glad if we get our land back. Karabakh,
and if we can live in Khojaly again.
Well, to explore how this ongoing conflict can be resolved, I'm joined now by former US Ambassador to Azerbaijan, Matthew Bryza, and the head of the Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, Ahmed Shahidov, and finally Richard Geragosyan. He's the director of the Regional Studies Center, an independent think tank based in Armenia. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. Ahmed, I want to begin with you. People talk about justice for Khojaly. What does that mean? What would it mean now, 26 years on?
Yes, thank you. First of all, we need to pay attention to the basic course of this conflict. The Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict is the oldest ongoing conflict in the post-Soviet area, and the base course of the conflict lies in the centuries-long Armenian territorial claims against Azerbaijan. And in early 1988, the Armenians started aggressive actions against Azerbaijan to implement the long-standing plan to secede Nagorno-Karabakh from Azerbaijan and annex it to Armenia. So in late 1991 and early 1992, armed hostilities and Armenian attacks on Azerbaijan intensified, and Khojaly, the town in Nagorno-Karabakh, became the target of these operations. And from 25 to 26 of February in 1992, by the support of former USSR 366 regiment.
Do you think, and you're giving me a timeline here, and I'm sorry for being rude.
Sure.
Do you think it was ethnic cleansing and even genocide, as some have claimed?
You know, the events in Khojaly is accepted by the international community as massacre, as genocide, because on that night, the Armenian armed forces killed 613 civilian people, and including 106 women, children, elderly, and till today, 1,275 people were missed.
Sir, and if I can go back to my fundamental question,
yes.
What would justice mean for you today, in the year 2018?
You know, justice for Khojaly means that all international community must recognize these events as massacre, as genocide, because there are a lot of evidence like photos, videos showing all these massacres, killing, and the Azerbaijani journalist Chingiz Mustafayev recorded all these events.
So you want recognition?
Yes.
That's what you want. Richard, is it fair to say that Armenia has struggled to come to terms with the fact that they did unspeakable things on February 25th and 26th, 1992?
I would say no, only because in the wider context, as distressing, as disturbing as the incidents were, it was part of a bigger chain of events from anti-Armenian pogroms in Sumgait and Baku onward. What worries me much more is trying to escape being a prisoner of the past and actually trying to deal with a very difficult present and looking to the future.
But why can't both be done? To say, okay, this was a terrible massacre, civilians were massacred, the war was terrible, let's move forward. And
clearly, yes. The events, whether it's a crime of genocide is a very difficult term to apply, especially in this context. Regardless, the loss of life, the tragedy, is a demonstration that all sides have suffered grossly. And yes, there does require a painful but sincere look at the past. My focus here, though, is we have people dying on a weekly basis now in this conflict. And in many ways, if we become too obsessed with one isolated incident rather than the wider context, this doesn't contribute to an environment conducive to a negotiated solution with concession and compromise from all sides.
Okay, and I'm going to get Ahmed's response to that in just a moment. But first, Matthew Bryza, as a former US ambassador to Azerbaijan, somebody who saw this unfold over the years in terms of peace negotiations and a frozen conflict, tell me why it's been so difficult to get anywhere near some sort of solution.
Well, I actually was one of the international mediators of the conflict for 3 years. We have a group called the Minsk Group under the OSCE with a Russian, French, and US ambassador. And I can say we got pretty close in the springtime of 2009, and then in the autumn as well. The basic outlines of an agreement exist, and the basic principles have been agreed in principle by both sides. The problem is that what the political leadership finds acceptable is not acceptable in the broader societies because so many emotions are still so raw, whether it's about Khojaly or whether it's about protecting of civilians on both sides, whether it's about the fundamental legal status of Karabakh, and it all plays also back into the history of Turkey and Armenia in 1915 and all those events as well.
Right. So people have long memories, deep wounds. Ahmed, would you accept Richard's argument that whatever happened, the people can't be held hostage by the past and need to move forward?
You know, as Mr. Grigoryan mentioned about the, I would say, to look to the future for both countries. I am not politician, I am not historian, but I am human rights defender, and I care about the rights of civilian people living in front line, about the women, children. But after 25 years, after the Khojaly Massacre, today we cannot look to the future and to, how to say, because the Armenian side continues the violation of international law, violation of human rights in front line. For example, I took the photo of this 2-year-old Zahra. She was killed last year.
If you want to show, I mean, you can hold it up
in
a bit.
July.
Yeah, so we'll
in July, in Al-Khanli village of Fizuli district, during the armed shelling by the Armenian armed forces, she was killed, and it happened after 25 years after Khojaly massacre, and it shows that the Armenian side is not ready for living together to get the peace, prosperity in this region.
Okay, so Richard, the point is that what he's saying is that the status quo at the moment, low-intensity conflict suits Armenia, and it's easier for Armenia than it is for Azerbaijan.
Well, I would respectfully disagree. I don't think anyone is benefiting from the current escalation in tension. There are losses on both sides, but equally painfully, whether it's the death of a tragic infant or toddler, we have similar examples on all sides. My point here is, in many ways, there is no winner for this. And in many ways, we need to find ways to de-escalate and return and re-engage to diplomacy.
Must the
over force of
occupation
arms.
end first before any of that happens? Because we heard that from the foreign minister, ministry spokesman as well.
Realistically,
we heard about
no.
Israel, Palestine, we heard about everything. Well, Crimea as well. It's like, okay, pull out first, then we talk.
But realistically, no. And I say that because if we look at the course of mediation and the diplomatic negotiations, one of the few bargaining chips for the Armenian side is the territories beyond the borders of Nagorno-Karabakh and their return to Azerbaijan. This, in other words, any kind of demand as a prerequisite to real diplomacy is both dangerous and rather non-realistic.
Ahmed, non-realistic to ask for them to pull out before you can move forward.
You know, let's go to the reason of this conflict. And there are a lot of international norms, international law, and Geneva Convention. And according to all these norms, the territorial integrity, which is the basis of international law, territorial integrity of Azerbaijan has been violated. And Nagorno-Karabakh, the other adjacent 7 regions of Azerbaijan are still under occupation of Armenia. In spite of that, there are 4 resolutions of UN Security Council about immediately releasing these occupied territories and returning Azerbaijan refugees to these lands. Another international resolutions of OSCE, Council of Europe, the Armenian authorities don't care about this resolution. But Azerbaijan is a multicultural country. We haven't any problem with Armenian nation. And today, in 2018, there are 35,000 Armenians living in Azerbaijan. Even in the center of the Baku capital city, Baku, we have Armenian church. But unfortunately, Armenia destroyed all mosques in Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's not against only Azerbaijan. It's against the, I would say, humanity. But in spite of that, after 30 years of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, we are ready to get the peace and prosperity. But there are concrete reasons for getting this peace.
I want to ask you about something. You mentioned the UN Security Council and resolutions.
Yes.
How do you feel about the fact that Russia's on the UN Security Council? And so
you know,
they're going to support Armenia no matter
there
what.
are 5 members of UN Security Council, and all of them accepted them, these 4 resolutions. It happened in 1992 and 1993. All these resolutions talks about the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. Even the Armenia didn't recognize the Nagorno-Karabakh as an independent country. It means that Armenia recognized territorial integrity of Azerbaijan.
Right.
But why we cannot get this peace? So it means that Armenia should make first step to release these occupied territories. Then the Azerbaijani refugees will return to these Nagorno-Karabakh as occupied lands. Then we are ready to give highest status for Nagorno-Karabakh.
You want them to make the first move,
sure.
right? And Richard's saying that's unrealistic for now. Matthew Brysup, we saw big trouble in 2016. It flared up. Yeah. We saw the Armenian president and an Azerbaijani diplomat trade barbs at the Munich Security Conference recently. How close are we to something really terrible happening very soon?
I think we're less close than a lot of people fear. I think nothing big and terrible is going to happen without some premeditation. And that's because the sides, they know what is required if there's going to be a major military maneuver. And I think you'd have to see the mobilization of significant, at least Azerbaijani forces. But that doesn't mean terrible things don't happen. I mean, as Richard was saying, well, we want to see an end to these people being killed along the front lines, whether they're soldiers or as you were saying, whether they're civilians. I think the bargain here in play and why there hasn't been the fulfillment of the Security Council resolutions is indeed that the structure of the agreement that's been negotiated for years and sort of agreed in principle by both sides is that the 7 territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh will be returned to Azerbaijan. The occupied territories will be returned to Azerbaijan in exchange for some expression of self-determination of the Armenian majority population in Nagorno-Karabakh. That's a difficult balance to strike, but I think the parties have struck it. Now it's time for political courage to push this through the societies.
Talking about political courage and the broader geopolitics of it all and political will, does it help that Turkey and Russia are somewhat decent with each other right now, because one side backs Azerbaijan and the other Armenia, generally in this conflict?
Yeah. Well, I think it generally doesn't hurt. In fact, it's a good thing for the region if Turkey and Russia are not at each other's throats like they were after the downing of that Russian aircraft that violated Turkish airspace. When it comes to Karabakh, I think that ultimately there has to be an active role by the United States president, because no matter what is agreed, if Russia supports it, even in Armenia there's going to be suspicion, and even more so in Azerbaijan. So there needs to be some sort of imprimatur of someone seen, of a side that's seen as being somewhat more neutral. One last point about neutrality that's ironic or disadvantageous for some in Azerbaijan is that the 3 mediators of the Minsk group, Russia, France, and the United States, actually are the countries with the 3 largest Armenian diasporas. So that's hard to swallow in Azerbaijan sometimes.
Right, that's fascinating. Right, we're almost running out of time. So Richard Geragosyan, give me some room for optimism.
I am optimistic. Chosen to live in Armenia, moving there from the United States. I'm optimistic because we're approaching a tipping point where force of arms, the military solution, is increasingly revealed to be an empty avenue. And in many ways, we need to recommit to diplomacy now in terms of confidence-building measures. The second grounds for optimism is we may reach a solution based on statesmanship and based on demographic change, where the new generations coming to power in the region understand the fatigue and the conflict has exerted too high of a cost. And in many ways, April 2016, the most serious fighting was important in terms of changing the landscape. Azerbaijan took back territory for the first military victory in many years. This should be a degree of more self-confidence by Azerbaijan and a return to diplomacy. This is what we're investing in.
Ahmed Shahidov, when you hear Richard say that, do you feel, well, if more Armenians thought like Richard did, maybe we'd get close to some sort of peace deal?
I agree with only one idea of Richard about there is no winner in Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. only external powers, foreign powers who controls, for example, Armenia, they benefit from this conflict. If the Armenian people, the ordinary Armenians, should understand the real situation in Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and push the authorities to sit face to face with Azerbaijani government and gain the peace resolution and how to say to respect the international law, international conventions. I think that Azerbaijanis and Armenians should live together, both in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in Nagorno-Karabakh region and other regions, but by respecting the international law, the territorial integrity of both countries, the human rights, and everything will be okay.
Well, it's been ongoing for almost 3 decades. It's been important to have this discussion because even people who claim to be in the know about the world, whether Syria, Afghanistan, the Balkans, whatever, generally have no clue about this. And I think that's why it's extremely important, myself included, you know, and I think it's really important to have this discussion. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Coming up on the Newsmakers, was this the right outfit for Canada's Prime Minister to wear on an official state trip to India? And has Baghdad really defeated Daesh? We asked the White House's former director on Iraq. Justin Trudeau is taking a thrashing over his official state trip to India. The government seemed to snub Canada's Prime Minister on the tarmac, sending a low-level official to greet him. Social media mocked Trudeau for touring the country in traditional Indian wedding garb. And the PM's political rivals lashed out after his team invited a man convicted of attempted murder to a dinner reception. So, was this a diplomatic disaster? We have a lot to talk about, but first, let's begin with this report by Shoaib Hassan.
The Canadian Prime Minister's trip seemed to follow Murphy's Law, that anything that could go wrong would go wrong. And for Justin Trudeau's state visit to India, there were a lot of things that did. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi wasn't at the airport to welcome Trudeau with his trademark hug. Instead, he sent a junior agriculture minister to fill in. The apparent reason for the snub was the Trudeau government's alleged support for Sikh separatism. In particular, a movement demanding a separate homeland for Sikhs in India, known as Khalistan. Sikh leaders wanted to carve it out of the Punjab region, divided between India and Pakistan during partition in 1947. The movement was largely peaceful until an army operation in 1984. Codenamed Operation Blue Star, then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi ordered troops to evict militants from inside the Golden Temple in Amritsar, the Sikhs' holiest site. The raid was seen as a desecration by Sikhs and led to Gandhi being assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguards. That in turn led to riots in which an estimated 8,000 Sikhs were lynched by Hindu mobs. The following year, Sikh militants were suspected of carrying out Canada's worst ever terror attack, the bombing of an Air India flight from Toronto, which killed all 329 people on board, most of them Canadians of Indian origin. The armed Sikh insurgency across the Indian Punjab that followed the riots lasted till 1992. That year, Indian forces did manage to bring the situation under control, but have since been accused of resorting to human rights violations to do so. This has particularly been voiced by the strong Sikh diaspora in US and Canada.
I raised the issue of Khalistan because that is our primary issue. There is money coming from various countries, including Canada, to Punjab to create this ruckus. And the Prime Minister is aware of it, and he's told me that he's going to look into this.
Since his election, Justin Trudeau seems to be one of the most adored politicians around the world. His liberal outlook and movie star looks appeal to those looking for an alternative to a Trump White House. But with the failure to tackle problems back home, including Canada's worsening housing crisis, his popularity has dropped, with critics panning him for being more worried about his image. And commentators now call his trip to India a diplomatic disaster, not helped by his continued dancing and posing for photos at monuments. And by the sixth day, when then Modi hug did finally come, many Canadians had already begun asking where it all went wrong for Trudeau in India. Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, let's go to our panel now. I'm joined from Toronto by Chris Alexander. He was the Canadian Immigration Minister under former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. In Vancouver, we have Moninder Singh. He's the spokesman of the Sikh Liberation Front Canada. And in Bangalore, a leader within India's ruling party, the BJP, Buddha Chandrasekhar. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Buddha, let me begin with you. Trudeau in India, was it a mess?
No, not really. See, we had a very good agreements with the Canada government, and the Prime Minister and his family enjoyed this official trip. And India and Canada are part of G20 as well as G7. And we had a similar kind of a democracy process in place. And I think this is the right time for Canada Prime Minister to understand and the diversity of this country and a lot of local, conditions. So I see this as a very good opportunity for both the countries to learn each other, like, how Modi ji visited, the India Prime Minister visited Canada and had a, very good interaction with them. And similarly, Canada Prime Minister too had a similar kind of a experience. See, life is about experiences.
Right.
So he also experienced along with his family. He has seen different kind of, patterns in India. And he also understood that, there are a couple of concerns between India and Canada, which basically we discussed and, we sorted it.
Right. But let me ask you, and you're being very wise here, but let me ask you if you were offended by the fact that, for example, they invited somebody who was convicted of attempted murder, and this person was a Khalistani separatist. The fact that this person was invited to an event hosted by Canada, did that offend you?
Not really. Yeah, it's a matter of concern. I completely agree. But see, we see this in a different way. See, Canada is a energy resource country, and a lot of Indians are studying in Canada. And we really, we see this as kind of a replica. Canada is kind of one of the country, which we gel, with. And we see there is some small glitches, which we need to understand, because, every country has their own perceptions, and, they have some of his ministers, he may have, such kind of relationships. But yes, there are small glitch, but we need to completely take it like,
small glitches. Point well made.
Yeah,
Chris Alexander, I hate to sort of pull the rug from beneath your feet here, but I'm assuming you're going to say that Trudeau messed up when he went to India and he had a whole series of gaffes. But we're hearing from someone who's a member of the BJP saying, no, small glitches, we're good partners, we signed deals, we're strong political allies, water under the bridge, tiny little glitches, no big problem.
Listen, I'm very reluctant to criticize my leader, my Canadian Prime Minister, for anything that happens beyond our borders, because I think we have to show a common front. We have a national interest to pursue and a very important relationship with India. So I'm uncomfortable with this theme, and I'm proud of people like our Indian guest, Mr. Chandrasekhar, and others who've been taking the high road on this issue. We need to try to focus back on what is at stake here for two big democracies that want to liberalize trade, that have this enormous human relationship because people go back and forth as immigrants, as students, et cetera. But what I'm seeing in the commentary about this trip is very embarrassing for me as a Canadian, because it looks like our Prime Minister didn't show elementary respect for his Indian partners. He was there for a week. There was very little substance. He presented himself as a celebrity, tried to out Bollywood in some ways, and not as a statesman or a leader. Listen, in Toronto, a little less than a decade ago, India and Canada were instrumental in finding some of the solutions to the global financial crisis, in setting the world on a better course, which is generating growth around the world. I didn't see any discussion of those kinds of issues. And then there was this really serious lapse on a very elementary protocol issue. There are 36 million people in Canada he could have invited to come with him to facilitate the relationship, to help build things up in culture, in business. The last person who should have come is someone convicted of a violent crime, attempted murder, inspired by this misguided dream of Khalistani separatism. That is the absolute last person who should have come, and most people in India were rightly insulted by that. I personally was embarrassed, and when I think about it, I'm depressed.
Right. So, Moninder, I'm going to sort of put aside all the kind of cosplay and all the noise regarding his outfits and stuff, because some people were embarrassed, some people said, oh, he was being culturally sensitive. It's a big social media storm, right? Moninder, were you proud of him that he was willing to irritate the Indians, possibly on behalf of the Sikh constituency within Canada, people such as yourselves?
I don't think so. I don't think he was there to necessarily win over Sikh voters in Canada. He was playing his role as a Prime Minister of Canada. The problem with this entire story is that nobody is really looking into some of the facts that go around what Mr. Atwal was doing in India and how he got into India in the first place. The Indian government would have to actually clear his name for him to actually enter into India in the first place. So if this was such a medium storm, Mr. Atwal has entered India multiple times since 2002, twice in 2017, and again on this 2018 visit. This is no defense of him as an individual, but at the same time, we're looking at it from an angle as in like why there was a serious lapse in the PM's office around this person attending. That can be actually said as of yes, that this person probably had no business being there in the first place. But at the same time, when the Indian media and Indian counterparts are creating this storm around Prime Minister Trudeau, that this person should not have been in the country, he's a terrorist, he's this. What was he actually doing in the country? That would be up to the Indian Consular Services in Canada, the High Commissioner's Office in Canada, and the Indian government itself to actually say. The cultural appropriation of clothing and things like that, you know, these are mistakes as well. Like these things should not have happened on this trip. But for me, looking at it from strictly a Sikh perspective, and that's what I'm speaking to, the Khalistani misguided dream that Mr. Alexander dreams of is talking about. This is an aspiration of a people that after 1984, it was a popular movement within Punjab and still exists today. So to kind of brush it off as in like this extremist rhetoric that is constantly kind of shown in the media, I think this is very naive on the part of Mr. Alexander. Just to kind of on an opening statement, we're talking about legitimate movement for self-determination as sanctioned under the United Nations. This is a freedom of expression, freedom of right, freedom of political right. And I would actually go as far as saying as in 2012 when Prime Minister Harper was in India, he made similar comments around, he was being pushed into a corner to actually say that the Khalistan movement is an extremist movement and Sikhs in Canada are being labeled as extremists. And Mr. Harper at the time responded by saying we can't confuse freedom of expression and speech with extremism that Canadians, including Sikhs, have a right to advocate. So I would push it in that corner.
So let's get Chris to respond to that. Chris, are you trivializing the aspirations of a portion of the Sikh community in Canada to want their own separate state at some point?
Well, here we're talking about two things. I didn't hear our guest, my fellow guest, talking about a separate state. I heard him talking about self-government, self-determination, full recognition of the role of Sikhs and of the importance of Sikh religion within India. All of that is acceptable. Violence and violent struggle to separate from India is not acceptable. And there are people in Canada, including I think our guest, who run these two issues together in Canada, who are casual about both issues, or the violent issue especially. And that is unacceptable. Listen, Justin Trudeau's father led Canada at a time when we had a violent extremist movement organizing terrorist attacks in order to champion the separation of Quebec. That was unacceptable to all Canadians. Pierre Elliott Trudeau brought in martial law, the War Measures Act, in order to deal with that in 1970 at a particularly acute point in that drama. We cannot be having a double standard with India. This is a live issue for India. The violent Khalistani movement had roots here. The biggest terrorist attack in Canadian history was organized by Khalistani extremists based in Canada who are trying to pursue their ideas by violence. Okay. That is unacceptable for any, should be unacceptable for any Canadian Prime Minister, and indeed for the whole international community.
Okay, so let me go back to Moninder for your response, Moninder, and let me add to it what Trudeau said, giving assurances to Narendra Modi, saying that Canada supports one united India and that we are unanimous as a government, as ministers on this issue. So it's a no-go zone for the Canadian Prime Minister, isn't it? India's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And that's where Khalistan crashes into just general foreign policy, doesn't it?
The general foreign policy of most nations will always be to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of other nations. So this is common for us to kind of, as a people that are struggling for their own country, to actually come across. I don't think what Mr. Alexander said actually touches on the issue. He's talking about issues that have existed 30 years, 25 years prior. We're talking extremist labeling that's going on in today's world in 2018. And he's not touching on any of that right now. So my issue with this is that we're talking about a segment of a movement that can't be labeled as extremist just because one element of it at one time might have been in an armed struggle. That would be the same thing with the IRA, it would be the same thing with the Palestinians or the Kashmiris. All these movements have aspects and parallel movements that run within them. And those people that are on the ground in those territories, when the state itself, India is a state, even in 2018 with Human Rights Watch saying that it calls and crushes any type of dissent and shows it as anti-national. Senior leaders of the BJP, including just last month, Surinder Singh from the Uttar Pradesh, stated that by 2024 that India will be a Hindu nation, right. And if Muslims and other minorities want to stay within the borders, so that they should actually convert to Hinduism, or they're free to leave.
Can I take
these? If we're talking, about extremism, we should look at state extremism as well.
So fair enough. So you're mentioning something that is seen as a trend by critics of India. Let me take that and pass it on to Buddha here. Buddha, we have these accusations against India, and there's a feeling that even though there was a hug at the end and a nice photo op, and despite the fact that Trudeau tried very hard in his very colorful costumes, and he tried very hard throughout the trip, there's a general feeling, even though you call it glitches, that India snubbed him because he seems to be partial to Khalistani separatism, right? Whether it's true or not. Did India snub him?
No, not at all. We are very happy, and he's our guest, and he had a very nice time in India. And on top of it, he been to a lot of places. He learned different cultures evolved in India. He had a very nice family time. On top of it, he met a lot of business houses, and he been to a lot of business meetings. And we had a very good international deals. And we had one of the biggest deal what we had with Canada is from the energy sector point of view. And from education point of view also, we had a MOU with Canada. I clearly see that it's a successful trip, but someone is basically twisting the facts. So we are happy, and the matter of the fact is the day one, Modi was busy, my Prime Minister was busy with having a deal with Iranian Prime Minister. So that was the reason he is not able to meet Canada Prime Minister on day one.
Right.
So that's the fact.
Okay. Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately, I've got to move on, but it's been really good getting your different perspectives. At times, I felt as if we were having separate conversations here, but I'm glad it all converged in the end. Buddha Chandrasekhar, Moninder Singh, and Chris Alexander, thank you very much for joining us.
There isn't even 1 inch of Iraq's land under the control of Daesh, but there are sleeper cells here and there.
Daesh has killed more than 24 members of a pro-government Shia militia in northern Iraq, quashing any hope that the terrorist group has been fully defeated. Fighting broke out in the town of Hawija, which Daesh controlled until last October. 27 members of the popular mobilization units were killed. It happened just after international donors pledged $30 billion to help the country rebuild after its 4-year battle with Daesh. Well, to get more on this, we're joined now by Douglas Olivant. He was a top advisor for US Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, serving as the director of Iraq for the National Security Council. Doug, good to have you on the Newsmakers.
Always a pleasure.
So people look at Iraq and think Daesh is gone, ISIS has been defeated, and then we see attacks such as the one we saw in Hawija and other attacks on civilians, and we go, whoa, hold on, maybe not so fast. Is that where we're at? Are we underestimating their ability to regroup?
Well, everyone is always caveated. When you say Daesh is defeated as an organized military force, there's usually a caveat. We've moved into a new phase. Yes, we've just had this attack by Daesh against the Shia PMUs around Kirkuk, but this doesn't sound like what we've seen the last 3 years. This sounds like what we saw 10 years ago. This could have happened in 2005 or 2006. So we are back to the phase where Daesh is a ordinary, more or less, terrorist group. And while that isn't perfect, that's a much better place to be than what we've seen over the last 3 years, where they held territory and could commit atrocities en masse because they held territory.
Okay, so they're not building a country or a caliphate anymore. But we saw a double suicide bombing in January. Are we going to see perhaps a repeat of the worst of the sectarian-oriented terrorism that we saw a few years ago, where they might blow up the Shia, they might blow up a mosque on Friday Jummah prayers and stuff like that? Is it going to possibly get ugly because they don't have a place to stay and they're just going to use asymmetric tactics?
It depends on how effectively Baghdad pivots to address this new threat. If they are capable of moving to a intelligence-based force, if they retool the Golden Division to do its original mission of digging out these terrorist cells and finding and killing them before they can attack, then they'll do well. If they don't pivot, then Daesh will have the ability to regenerate.
What do you make of Trump's policy in Iraq right now, vis-a-vis defeating Daesh, but also just helping the Iraqis rebuild?
I think the Iraqis are getting what they need from the Americans. We, quite obviously did not contribute money at the Kuwait conference. We did give some export guarantees, but we are very committed to the military and police training mission in Baghdad. So you will continue to see, for as long as Iraq requests them, U.S. trainers training the Iraqi military, the Iraqi police forces, their entire defense and security establishment.
Is that the right policy, saying no nation building from us? We'll introduce you to our business partners, but we're not going to give you aid?
I think it's working. The Iraqis got what they needed. They have loan guarantees from the neighbors, most notably Turkey, who really did step up at the Kuwait conference. They have now essentially the line of credit that they need to begin their reconstruction of the infrastructure, to move forward on that, to jumpstart their economy. So the initial signs are good. We'll have to see how it plays out, of course.
I spoke to former Iraqi Prime Minister Iyad Allawi not too long ago, and he basically said his country is a client state of Iran right now. So let me ask you a big picture question here. As the US extricates itself from Iraq, tries to sort of not get too involved, as you guys have defeated Daesh, that's good. I wish you all the best. You can rebuild your country. At best, Iraq is a strong ally of Iran. At worst, it's a client state of Iran. After all these years, after everything, that must sting for Washington.
I think Washington would lean to the former interpretation. Yes, it's a strong ally of Iran, but that's been because the neighbors, for the most part, again, Turkey being the notable exception, have not been really involved inside Iraq, most notably the Saudis. That's really changed over the last year. We're seeing a new détente between Baghdad and Riyadh, and I think the United States really plans to work through its regional allies. The United States can only do so much in Iraq. One Iraqi told me, kind of quipped, the United States does okay in Iraq for a country that's 3,000 miles away. Right. So we really do need to rely on the neighbors and work through the neighbors we have good relationships with.
As somebody who deals with the Iraqis on a daily basis, as an American, as somebody who was within the system, in the White House, in the Pentagon, and so on, in general, what do the Iraqis want from you?
I I think the Iraqis want us not to stop paying attention. They want the diplomatic support. When you talk to the Iraqis, they want the full implementation of our strategic framework agreement. Not just the military piece, but the culture, the economic, the educational, a full relationship with the United States that's more than the one-dimensional security relationship we've had over the past decade.
And as we circle back to Daesh, and we worry about it reconstituting itself as a military force and so on, we know that after Al-Qaeda came Daesh, it had the same sort of roots, but it was a different organization. Can we say that the Iraqi government is doing all it can to ensure that Daesh or something similar doesn't re-emerge?
I think they're making, you can always do more, but they are making good steps. The politics in Baghdad now is very, very different. We're starting to see cross-sectarian lists. There will be running on Prime Minister Abadi's list Sunni candidates in Anbar and in Nineveh. There will be Kurds running on his list. We're seeing a very new dimension to the politics. People who are outside the politics, figures like Harith al-Dari, are now inside the system, working inside the political system, not outside funding insurgents. Things are changing. Now, whether that's good enough to prevent the resurgence of a Daesh or the Daesh 2.0 we all hear about, we'll just have to wait and see.
So, okay, clearly it's not the same as it was under Nouri al-Maliki, where it was almost like the politics of the victors, right? And Sunnis felt disenfranchised. Do you feel it's enough and it's being done fast enough, especially in the atmosphere of Daesh widows being executed and so on? There still seems to be a bitter taste in the mouths of many Sunnis. I don't want to speak on their behalf, but you get a flavor of it when you read about what the refugees are saying, people who have been kicked out of their homes or had their family members killed by Hajjali and that sort of thing. So do you feel it's happening fast enough?
It's never fast enough. But things are more complicated. When you read about the Daesh widows being executed, that's usually by other Sunnis in tribal disputes. So it's much, much more complicated.
Oh, no, I mean Daesh widows like being tried, sort of.
Being tried and executed. Yes, that's the case. But the reintegration of Daesh families is usually intertribal.
It's complicated.
It's very complicated.
But are you optimistic?
Cautiously.
Cautiously optimistic. Douglas Oliphant, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Always a pleasure.
And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, it's being called Hell on Earth. We examine whether chemical weapons are killing civilians under a ceasefire in Syria's besieged suburb of eastern Ghouta. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.